The cold wind howled across the desolate landscape of Cygnus X7, whipping dust and ice particles against the reinforced windows of Kalen's outpost. The structure, little more than a prefabricated shelter with modest additions he'd made over the years, stood in defiant solitude against the barren moon's harsh environment. Inside, Kalen moved through his daily routine with mechanical precision, his actions perfected through years of repetition. Check oxygen levels. Monitor external temperatures. Inspect water recycling system. Inventory rations. Each task performed with the detached efficiency of a man who had reduced his existence to a series of survival procedures. 5 years on this forgotten corner of space, and each day blurred into the next with numbing sameness. Occasionally, Kalen's gaze would drift to the small medical kit that remained meticulously organized in its wall cabinet, a reminder of the life he had abandoned. His fingers, once steady and confident in saving lives, now merely pressed buttons and flipped switches in the mindless rhythm of survival. Sleep, wake, work, repeat. The pattern had become Kalen's fortress against memories, against the haunted eyes of the young woman who had died on his operating table back on Centauri Station. Dr. Kalen Drave, the brilliant trauma surgeon whose hands had failed when it mattered most. His sister's daughter, his only family, dead because of his overconfidence, his fatal miscalculation during what should have been a routine procedure. The guilt had driven him here, to this moon where supply ships arrived twice annually, depositing necessities without requiring human contact, where he could punish himself with isolation and the daily struggle against an environment that seemed determined to kill him. Kalen was at his monitoring station when the anomaly appeared on his sensors. A small vessel, moving too fast, trajectory unstable, clearly in distress. Not a scheduled supply ship, not a military craft. Its signature matched nothing in his database. He watched dispassionately as its erratic path took it closer to the moon's surface, calculating that it would crash approximately 12 kilometers from his outpost. The impact shook the ground enough that Kalen felt the vibration through his boots. A distant flash illuminated the horizon, followed by absolute silence. He turned away from the viewport, telling himself it wasn't his concern. The Cygnus system was remote, but occasionally traversed by independent traders, explorers, and those like himself, seeking obscurity. Whoever had crashed had made their choice to venture into this treacherous region. Their fate was their own responsibility. Yet, 3 hours later, Kalen found himself securing his environment suit and checking the charge on his rover. He told himself it was mere curiosity, perhaps a need to salvage useful materials. He wouldn't admit, even to himself, that something buried beneath layers of determined isolation, some vestige of the healer he once was, had stirred at the thought of possible survivors. The journey across the moon's broken terrain was arduous. Kalen navigated around deep crevices and over frozen ridges, the rover's lights cutting through the perpetual twilight that passed for daytime on Cygnus X7. As he approached the crash site, the true extent of the devastation became clear. The ship, unlike any he had seen before, had carved a kilometer-long trench before coming to rest against a rock formation. Its hull was fractured in multiple places with an otherworldly material that seemed to shimmer despite the catastrophic damage. No survivors, Kalen muttered to himself, surveying the wreckage through his helmet visor. It was better this way. No complications, no responsibilities. He would check for salvageable technology or supplies, then return to his outpost and his carefully constructed emptiness. That's when he heard it, a sound so faint that at first he thought it was merely the settling of superheated metal cooling in the moon's frigid atmosphere. But it came again, a soft, keening noise unlike anything he'd encountered before. Following the sound, Kalen moved cautiously through the debris field toward what appeared to be the remains of the cockpit. What he found stopped him in his tracks. Among twisted metal and shattered crystalline components lay a figure, trapped beneath a section of collapsed bulkhead. It was humanoid, but undeniably alien. The being was slender, with skin that seemed to shift between shades of deep blue and violet, depending on how the light struck it. Fine, filament-like hair the color of starlight, framed a face with features that were almost human, yet subtly different. Larger, almond-shaped eyes, a slightly elongated neck, and what appeared to be small, translucent ridges along the temples. But what seized Kalen's attention was the arm, bent at an impossible angle, bone visibly protruding through skin that wept a silvery fluid. The alien's eyes, irises an iridescent violet ringed with gold, fixed on him with an expression that transcended species barriers. Pain, fear, a desperate plea. 5 years of emotional detachment shattered in that moment. Kalen's medical training took over before conscious thought could intervene. He carefully shifted the debris, pinning the alien down, wincing sympathetically at the involuntary sounds of agony this produced. The being was female, as far as he could determine, dressed in what appeared to be a fitted flight suit of an unfamiliar material. Her uninjured arm raised weakly, either in defense or supplication. He couldn't be sure. "I'm not going to hurt you," Kalen said, knowing his words meant nothing to her, but hoping his tone might convey his intent. "That arm needs treatment. You need shelter. There's nothing left of your ship that will sustain life." Working methodically, he assessed her injuries. Beyond the catastrophic compound fracture of her right arm, she had lacerations across her torso and what appeared to be a significant head wound. Her breathing was labored but steady. With careful movements, Kalen used components from his emergency medical kit to improvise a splint for the broken arm, applying pressure bandages to stem the flow of silvery blood. The alien watched his every move, her body tensed with pain and wariness. When he touched the broken arm to stabilize it, she emitted a high-pitched sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, but she didn't struggle. Whether from trust or simply exhaustion, she allowed his ministrations. "I need to move you," Kalen explained, gesturing toward his rover. "My outpost is some distance away. It's not much, but it has medical supplies and shelter." Making the decision to bring her back violated every rule of isolation he had established for himself. Yet, leaving her to die slowly in the wreckage seemed a cruelty beyond even his capacity for self-punishment. With careful movements, he lifted her. She was surprisingly light, almost ethereal in his arms despite her height being similar to a human woman's. The broken arm hung at an awkward angle, and each step he took elicited small sounds of pain from her that she seemed to try to suppress. The journey back to the outpost became a battle against the moon's punishing environment. A dust storm had risen, reducing visibility and threatening to strand them in the open. Kalen felt the alien shivering against him, her body temperature seemingly dropping rapidly. He pushed the rover to its limits, racing against time and the elements, all while maintaining a steady pressure on her worst wounds. By the time they reached the outpost, the alien's consciousness was fading. Her eyes, those remarkable violet orbs, fluttered as he carried her through the airlock and into the sterile confines of what had been his exclusive domain for half a decade. Laying her on his narrow sleeping platform, Kalen worked with an urgency he hadn't felt since his days in the emergency medical ward. He cut away the strange fabric of her flight suit around the injuries, cleaned the wounds as best he could with universal antiseptics, and then faced the most challenging task, setting the badly broken arm. "This will hurt," he said, knowing she couldn't understand but needing to say something. "But it's necessary." The procedure was gruesome. The bone had splintered in multiple places, and as he manipulated it back into position, the alien's screams transcended language. Her good arm flailed, catching him across the face with surprising strength. Kalen persisted, drawing on years of training that his self-imposed exile hadn't entirely erased. When the bone was finally realigned, he immobilized it with a makeshift splint fashioned from medical supplies and components salvaged from his equipment stores. Throughout the night, Kalen maintained his vigil. The alien drifted between consciousness and a state of semi-conscious delirium, occasionally making sounds that might have been speech in her language. He administered small amounts of water, which she accepted after initial hesitation, and monitored her vital signs as best he could without knowledge of her species' baseline readings. By morning, or what passed for it in the artificial cycle Kalen maintained within the outpost. The alien's condition had stabilized. She lay still, watching him with unwavering attention as he moved about the cramped space, preparing nutrient supplements that he hoped wouldn't poison her. Her vigilance was unnerving. Those violet eyes followed his every movement, analyzing, assessing. "You need to eat," Kalen said, offering a simple broth. He demonstrated by taking a small sip himself, then extending the container toward her. After a moment's hesitation, she reached with her uninjured arm and accepted it, sniffing the contents before taking a tentative taste. Finding it acceptable, or at least not immediately toxic, she drank slowly. The next few days established a routine of sorts. Kalen would check and clean her wounds, adjust the splint on her arm, offer food and water, all while maintaining a running commentary that she couldn't understand, but that seemed to soothe them both. The silence of the outpost, once his refuge, now felt oppressive when filled only with the sounds of his own voice. The alien remained largely silent, communicating through gestures and expressions that grew less fearful and more curious as time passed. Kalen found himself studying her with professional interest that gradually developed shades of personal fascination. Her skin had a subtle luminescence to it, almost translucent in certain light. The silvery fluid he'd initially identified as blood seemed to serve a similar function, but clearly had different properties. Her respiratory rate was slower than humans, and she appeared to require less food and water. Most notably, her injuries, particularly the lacerations, were healing at an accelerated rate. On the fourth day, as Kalen changed the dressing on her arm, he noticed her studying his hands with intense concentration. When he finished, she slowly raised her uninjured hand and mimicked his movements, then pointed to the medical kit. The message was clear. She wanted to understand what he was doing. "It's just basic field medicine," Kalen explained, finding himself strangely self-conscious under her scrutiny. "Nothing special. The bone needs time to knit. I'm just keeping the wound clean to prevent infection." He demonstrated each item in the kit, naming them aloud, even though she couldn't comprehend the words. Antiseptic, bandage, analgesic. To his surprise, she attempted to repeat the sounds, her pronunciation creating entirely new words that nonetheless carried the cadence of his speech. It was the first genuine moment of attempted communication, and Kalen felt something shift within him, a warmth he had thought long extinguished. That night, as he sat at his monitoring station while she slept, he found himself looking at her reflection in the dark viewport rather than the desolate landscape beyond. The outpost, designed for one person, forced a proximity that would have been uncomfortable under different circumstances. Kalen fashioned a separate sleeping area for himself, giving the alien his bunk while he made do with an improvised pallet on the floor. The close quarters meant they were never more than a few meters apart. Initially, this created a tension that had them both moving with exaggerated care around each other, but as days stretched into weeks, the awkwardness gradually gave way to a choreographed coexistence. Kalen established a regimen of physical therapy for the alien's injured arm. The bone was healing remarkably well, another indication of her species' resilience, but the muscles and tendons needed rehabilitation to prevent atrophy. These sessions became their primary mode of interaction, with Kalen guiding her through gentle movements and exercises, demonstrating with his own arm when necessary. During one such session, nearly 3 weeks after the crash, the alien made a sound unlike her previous vocalizations. It was deliberate, directed at him, and repeated with emphasis when he didn't immediately react. "Lyra," she said, placing her good hand against her chest. Then she pointed at him, head tilted in clear interrogation. "You're telling me your name?" Kalen realized aloud. He mirrored her gesture, hand to his chest. "Kalen. Kalen," she repeated, the name transformed by her accent, but recognizable. Her lips curved in what he realized was her first smile since the crash. "Lyra," he echoed, feeling strangely moved by this simple exchange. From that point, their communication expanded rapidly. Lyra proved remarkably adept at acquiring language. She began with nouns, pointing at objects and repeating their names after Kalen provided them. Soon she was stringing together simple phrases. Arm hurt less. Food good. Kalen helped Lyra. The outpost systems fascinated her. When Kalen performed routine maintenance, she observed intently, occasionally pointing out anomalies he had overlooked. Once, when the environmental regulator malfunctioned during a particularly violent dust storm, Lyra indicated a connection in the circuitry that Kalen had dismissed. Her suggestion proved correct, potentially saving them from a dangerous drop in oxygen levels. "You understand this technology," Kalen said, studying her with new appreciation. "Your people must be far more advanced than ours." Lyra shrugged, a human gesture she had adopted. "Different," she said simply. "Not better." As Lyra's arm continued to heal and her mobility improved, she began contributing more actively to the daily operations of the outpost. She took over certain tasks, rearranged the living space to create more efficiency, and even attempted to prepare meals from their limited supplies. Her presence transformed the sterile functionality of the outpost. Small decorative elements appeared, geometric patterns etched into unused surfaces, a collection of crystalline formations gathered during their brief excursions outside to test her increasing strength. One evening, as a particularly fierce storm raged outside, the outpost's power fluctuated. The lights dimmed, and the temperature began to drop as the heating system struggled. Kalen worked frantically to stabilize the failing power core, aware that without it, they would both freeze before morning. Lyra joined him, her now partially functional right arm allowing her to assist in ways that would have been impossible weeks earlier. They worked in the semi-darkness, shoulders touching as they adjusted connections and rerouted power. When the system finally stabilized, they remained side by side, watching the diagnostic display return to normal parameters. Lyra's hand brushed against Kalen's, a fleeting contact that sent an unexpected current through him. Neither moved away. "Thank you," Kalen said, suddenly aware of how long it had been since he had genuinely thanked another being for anything. Lyra looked at him with those extraordinary eyes. "We live," she said simply, but her hand remained close to his, a warmth in the chilled air of the outpost. That night marked a subtle shift in their relationship. The careful distance Kalen had maintained, born partly of medical propriety and partly of his long-practiced isolation, began to dissolve. They spoke more, Lyra's improving command of his language allowing for deeper exchanges. She asked about the outpost, about Cygnus X7, about why he lived alone in such a desolate place. Kalen found himself sharing small details about his life, his training as a doctor, his work on various stations throughout human space, carefully edited versions of his past. He omitted the central tragedy, the reason for his self-imposed exile, but Lyra seemed to sense the gaps in his narrative. She didn't press, but her gaze held understanding beyond her words. In turn, she began to reveal fragments of her own story. Lyra belonged to a species she called the Ilari, from a system far beyond the boundaries of known human space. Her people were explorers and diplomats, establishing contact with other species throughout the galaxy. She had been on a solo reconnaissance mission when her ship experienced a catastrophic navigation system failure, sending her off course into uncharted regions. "My people will not search," she explained one evening as they shared meal. "Too far. Too dangerous." Lyra knew risk. "You were alone on that ship?" Kalen asked. "No crew." Lyra nodded. "Small ship. Only need one." She flexed her healing arm, now capable of most normal movements though still weaker than the other. "Lucky Kalen found Lyra." "Lucky," Kalen repeated, not quite believing in the concept, but unable to deny that her presence had changed something fundamental within the barren existence he had created for himself. As Lyra's strength returned, they began venturing outside the outpost for longer periods. Kalen showed her the harsh beauty of Cygnus X7, the crystal formations in the northern ridge, the strange, low-gravity dust patterns that formed in the wake of storms, the distant silver gleam of the system's ringed gas giant visible during certain astronomical alignments. Lyra approached each new discovery with a wonder that made Kalen see his surroundings with fresh eyes. During one such excursion, they visited the remains of Lyra's ship. The wreckage had been further damaged by storms, but certain components remained salvageable. Lyra collected specific pieces of technology, explaining that they contained data and personal effects. Standing amid the scattered remnants of her vessel, she grew quiet, her expression difficult to read. "I was running," she said finally, the admission coming unexpectedly. "Not just exploring." Kalen waited, giving her space to continue if she chose. "My people divided. Political conflict. I supported wrong faction." She touched a damaged console with gentle fingers. "Exile or imprisonment?" "I chose exile." Her violet eyes met his. Like Kalen, the perception startled him. "How did you know?" "Eyes hold same pain, same loss." Lyra gestured around them at the desolate landscape. "Nobody chooses this solitude without reason." The transparency of her insight broke something in Kalen. Standing amid the wreckage of her ship, he found himself speaking of what he had never intended to share. The failed surgery, his niece's death, the unbearable guilt that had driven him to the furthest reaches of inhabited space. "I was respected, trusted, the best trauma surgeon on Centauri Station." His voice grew hollow with remembered pain. "Alia was the only family I had left. Her mother, my sister, died years before. When Alia was injured in a transport accident, everyone said if anyone could save her, it would be me." Kalen stared at his hands, the same hands that had once been so confident in their skill. "There was a complication during surgery, something I should have anticipated but didn't. She died on my table while I tried desperately to correct my mistake." The admission felt like tearing open a wound that had never properly healed. "I couldn't face anyone after that. Couldn't trust my own judgment. So I disappeared. Came here where I couldn't harm anyone else through my failures." Lyra listened without interruption. When he finished, she stepped closer and, with deliberate gentleness, took his hand in hers. She raised it, examining his fingers with careful attention before placing his palm against her healing arm. "This hand heals," she said simply. "Made mistakes. Yes, all beings do. But this hand saved Lyra." The gesture, so direct and genuine, pierced the armor of isolation Kalen had built around himself. He felt the steady pulse of life beneath his fingers, life that existed because of his intervention, not despite it. Lyra's forgiveness for a tragedy she hadn't experienced offered a perspective he had denied himself for years. They returned to the outpost in a silence more intimate than any conversation could have been. That night, as the artificial lighting dimmed to simulate evening, Lyra approached Kalen at his monitoring station. Without words, she extended her healing arm, inviting his inspection. The limb moved with growing strength and coordination. The external signs of injury now little more than fading marks on her luminescent skin. "Almost complete healing," Kalen observed, professional assessment mixing with personal wonder at her resilience. "Your species recovers remarkably quickly. Some injuries heal faster than others," Lyra replied, her grasp of language now sophisticated enough for nuance. She placed her hand over his heart. "Some still need time." The gesture should have felt intrusive, even presumptuous. Instead, Kalen experienced it as an offering, an acknowledgement of pain with a promise of possible healing. He covered her hand with his own, feeling the subtle differences in her physiology, the slightly elevated temperature, the almost imperceptible vibration that seemed characteristic of her species. "I don't know if that kind of healing is possible," he admitted. "All healing begins with believing it possible," Lyra said. She didn't remove her hand. In the days that followed, their relationship evolved with both subtlety and profound significance. Physical distance diminished as emotional barriers fell. They worked side by side, ate together, shared stories that gradually revealed more of their respective pasts. Lyra spoke of her world, a planet of twilight forests and vast oceans where her people built cities that harmonized with the natural environment. Kalen described Earth and the various colonies he had visited during his medical career, finding himself remembering the beauty he had once appreciated before grief narrowed his vision. Lyra's arm continued its remarkable recovery. Soon she could perform complex tasks requiring fine motor control. She took particular pleasure in creating small artistic works, intricate patterns carved into spare materials, delicate structures assembled from components Kalen had considered useless. One evening, she presented him with a palm-sized object that resembled a stylized human heart constructed from salvaged metal and crystalline shard from her ship. "What is this?" Kalen asked, turning the object in his hands, admiring the craftsmanship. "Ilari tradition," Lyra explained. "When someone heals you, you create something that represents the healing." She guided his fingers to a small indentation. When pressed, the object emitted a soft, pulsing glow and a gentle warmth. "It holds energy, memory, gratitude." Kalen found himself deeply moved by the gift. It occupied a prominent place in the living area, its occasional pulse of light a reminder of connection in the sterile environment of the outpost. As Cygnus X-7 completed another revolution around its distant sun, marking nearly 6 months since Lyra's crash, they established a comfortable rhythm of coexistence. The outpost, once merely a shelter, had transformed into something approaching a home. They expanded the hydroponic garden Kalen had maintained for supplementary nutrition, with Lyra introducing modifications that improved yield and variety. They established a more efficient water reclamation system using principles from Ilari technology that Lyra reconstructed from memory. One evening, as they sat together monitoring an approaching storm system, Lyra broached a subject they had both tacitly avoided. "The supply ship arrives soon," she said, referring to the semi-annual delivery that maintained the outpost. First time since Lyra arrived. Kayla nodded, suddenly tense. "In about 3 weeks, yes. Ship could take passenger. Return Lyra to human space." Her tone was carefully neutral. "From there, perhaps find way to regions where Ilari trade. Eventually return home." The possibility hung between them, disrupting the harmony they had established. Kalen had known this moment would come, had even prepared for it by documenting everything he had learned about Lyra's physiology and language to assist whoever might continue her medical care. Yet the thought of returning to his solitary existence after knowing her companionship created a hollow sensation in his chest. "Is that what you want?" he asked, matching her neutral tone while avoiding her gaze. Lyra was silent for a long moment. "What does Kalen want?" The question forced him to confront feelings he had allowed to develop without acknowledgement. "I want," he hesitated, then committed to honesty. "I want you to be where you'll be happy. Safe. If that's with your people, then the supply ship is your best chance." "Not what I asked," Lyra said gently but firmly. "What does Kalen want for Kalen?" The directness of her question left no room for evasion. "I want you to stay," he admitted, the words carrying the weight of years of self-imposed isolation finally confronted. "But I have no right to ask that. Your life is elsewhere. Your people. My people exiled me," Lyra reminded him. "Or I exiled myself. Same result." She moved closer, her now healed arm reaching to turn his face toward hers. Perhaps Lyra found new people. One person. The implication silenced Kalen. He looked into her violet eyes, seeing not the alien being he had rescued months ago, but the woman who had gradually, persistently breached the walls of his isolation, who had shown him that connection was still possible, even for someone who had withdrawn from all human contact. "If you stayed," he said slowly, "it wouldn't be as a patient or a guest. It would be as," he struggled to define what had developed between them. "Partner," Lyra supplied, the word carrying layers of meaning. "Equal. Companion." Her luminescent skin seemed to glow more intensely, reflecting her emotional state. "More." The last word hung between them, laden with possibilities neither had openly acknowledged until now. Kalen found himself at a precipice similar to the one he had faced after his niece's death, a moment requiring either retreat into the familiar pain of isolation or a step forward into uncertain vulnerability. This time, he chose differently. With careful movements that still honored the remaining distance between them, Kalen raised his hand to Lyra's face. Her skin felt warm beneath his fingers, that subtle vibration now familiar and welcome. She leaned into his touch, eyes closing briefly in what appeared to be contentment. "I don't know if this is possible," Kalen said softly. "We're from different worlds, different species." "Already possible," Lyra replied, opening her eyes to meet his gaze. "Already happening." She covered his hand with hers, then guided it to her completely healed arm. "You fix broken arm." Then she moved his hand to rest over his own heart. Lyra helps fix broken heart. Different healing. Same principle. The simplicity of her statement, contrasted with the complexity of what had developed between them, startled a laugh from Kalen, perhaps his first genuine laugh in years. Lyra's expression brightened at the sound, her features arranging themselves into her version of a smile. "Is that what you've been doing? Healing me?" Kalen asked, the question only half teasing. "Mutual healing," Lyra corrected. Lyra's arm, Kalen's heart, Lyra's loneliness, Kalen's guilt. She intertwined her fingers with his, both stronger together. In that moment, the remaining distance between them vanished. Whether Kalen moved first or Lyra, neither could later say. They came together in an embrace that acknowledged the differences in their physiology while celebrating the emotional symmetry they had discovered. Lyra's skin emitted a soft glow that illuminated the dim interior of the outpost, casting everything in a gentle violet light. Their first kiss was an exploration, tentative, curious, discovering how two species might express affection despite different evolutionary paths. Lyra's lips were warmer than a human's, carrying that same subtle vibration that seemed to transfer to Kalen wherever they touched. The sensation was foreign, yet entirely welcome, symbolic of the bridge they had built between their separate worlds. When they separated, Kalen found himself looking at Lyra with new clarity. The alienness that had once defined her had transformed into a collection of beloved details. The iridescent quality of her eyes, the graceful length of her fingers, the way her luminescence intensified with emotion. "So you'll stay," he said, the question becoming a statement. "Lyra will stay," she confirmed, then added with a hint of playfulness, "unless Kalen still wants solitude." "I think I've had enough solitude for several lifetimes," Kalen replied, his arms still around her. "I'm ready for something different." In the days that followed, they made plans and adjustments. The outpost, designed for a single occupant, was modified to better accommodate two. They expanded the living space, combining their different aesthetic preferences into something new that represented their shared life. Lyra introduced elements of Alari design, geometric patterns that caught and diffused light, spaces arranged to maximize both functionality and beauty. Kalen contributed his knowledge of human comfort and practical needs. When the supply ship finally arrived, they met it together. The crew, minimal and typically disinterested in Kalen's isolated existence, reacted with understandable shock at Lyra's presence. Kalen provided a simplified explanation of her crash and rescue, emphasizing her status as a peaceful visitor from a previously unknown species. He requested additional supplies and equipment that would support their cohabitation while making it clear that Lyra was staying by choice. The ship's captain, after recovering from his initial surprise, agreed to report Lyra's presence to the appropriate authorities, likely ensuring future scientific and diplomatic interest in Cygnus X7. Kalen and Lyra had prepared for this inevitability, discussing how much of Ilari knowledge and technology Lyra was willing to share and under what circumstances. "They will come," Lyra said as they watched the supply ship depart, its thrusters glowing against the darkness of space. "Scientists, diplomats, military." "Probably," Kalen agreed, "but not for at least 6 months. We have time to prepare." Lyra leaned against him, her fully healed arm wrapping comfortably around his waist. "Time is good. Healing needs time." They returned to the outpost, their home, as the omnipresent wind of Cygnus X7 whispered across the barren landscape. Inside, warmth and light awaited. The small heart-shaped object Lyra had crafted pulsed with gentle illumination, a beacon in what had once been Kalen's fortress of solitude. Standing in the doorway, Kalen looked at the structure that had housed his self-imposed exile and now sheltered an unexpected partnership. The guilt and grief that had driven him to this desolate moon hadn't vanished entirely. Such deep wounds never disappeared completely, but they had transformed from a crushing weight to a manageable memory. He could think of Alia now without being consumed by remorse, could remember his life as a doctor without overwhelming shame. "What are you thinking?" Lyra asked, sensing his reflective mood. Kalen considered the question, then answered with simple honesty. "I'm thinking that sometimes healing comes from the most unexpected sources." He looked at her, this being from beyond the stars who had crashed into his carefully maintained isolation and systematically dismantled it. And in the most unexpected forms. Lyra's skin glowed with the blue-violet luminescence that he had come to recognize as contentment. "The universe has patterns we cannot always see," she said, an Alari expression he had learned meant something akin to "things happen for reasons beyond our understanding." As night fell on Cygnus X7, they stood together at the viewport, looking out at the desolate terrain that had once reflected Kalen's inner landscape. The barren moon remained unchanged, harsh, demanding, unforgiving. But the man observing it was transformed, his perspective irrevocably altered by the presence beside him. A human doctor had healed an alien woman's broken arm, and in return, she had mended his broken heart. Two beings from distant stars, finding in each other's differences not obstacles but completion. Their story was just beginning. A new chapter written across the infinite expanse of possibility that stretched before them like the star-filled sky beyond the viewport glass.